are some books that you don't just see recommended, you see them everywhere. They're on your TikTok feed. They're sitting on every fantasy reader's bookshelf. They're constantly mentioned whenever someone asks, what book should I read if I want to fall in love with fantasy? And eventually you reach a point where you have to ask yourself, is this book actually amazing? Or have I just heard people say it's amazing so many times that I assume it is? For me, that book was A Darker Shade of Magic. I have seen this book recommended over and over again. People talk about the Four Londons, they talk about Kell, they talk about Lila, they talk about how this book pulled them into a world of magic, danger, and adventure. But somehow, I had never actually read it. So today we're finally fixing that. I'm opening the pages of A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab for the first time, and we're finding out, was the hype actually worth it? If you love cozy reading content, fantasy worlds, and watching someone finally tackle the books that have been sitting on everyone's TBR list forever, you're in the right place. This channel is all about taking the books everyone talks about, diving into the stories, and figuring out which ones truly deserve the hype. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing and joining me on this journey, because there are a lot of books to read, and my TBR is getting a little out of control. Now, let's talk about A Darker Shade of Magic. Before we get into the actual story, I want to talk about why this book caught my attention. Because honestly, fantasy is one of those genres where the hardest part isn't finding books, it's choosing which one to start. There are thousands of fantasy books. Everyone has a recommendation, everyone has a favorite, and every time you finish one fantasy series, someone immediately tells you, okay, but now you have to read this one. And suddenly your TBR pile becomes impossible. A Darker Shade of Magic has always stood out to me because the concept is so simple, but also so interesting. 4 Londons, 4 different versions of the same city, different worlds existing beside each other, a character who can travel between them. That idea immediately grabbed me because I think the best fantasy concepts aren't just about magic. They're about asking, what if? What if there was another version of our world? What if there were places we couldn't see? What if magic existed, but only certain people knew? Those are the ideas that make fantasy so fun. Because fantasy isn't just about dragons and spells. It's about opening a door and wondering what could be on the other side. The biggest selling point of A Darker Shade of Magic is definitely the world. The story takes place across 4 different Londons, and each London has its own relationship with magic. The first is Grey London. Grey London is basically like our world, a world where magic has almost completely disappeared. People don't really believe in it anymore. It's ordinary, it's familiar. And honestly, there's something interesting about starting a fantasy story that feels somewhere normal, you know? Because it gives you that contrast. You understand what normal feels like, which makes the impossible moments stand out even more. Then we have Red London, and this is probably the version of London most fantasy readers would want to visit. Red London is full of magic. Magic is everywhere. It's part of everyday life. It's respected. It's understood. It feels alive. When people imagine a magical world, this is probably what they're picturing. A place where magic isn't hidden away. It's just another part of existence. Then we have White London, and this is where things get darker. White London is a place where magic isn't something beautiful. It's something people fight over. It's something people want to control. Power is everything. And the people who have power are willing to do almost anything to keep it, which creates a really interesting contrast between the Londons, because magic itself isn't necessarily good or evil. It's what people do with it. And I think that's one of the strongest ideas in this book. The question isn't, is magic dangerous? The question is, what happens when people become obsessed with controlling something they don't fully understand? And then there's Black London, the London nobody wants to talk about. The London that was destroyed by magic, a place that serves as a warning. A reminder that magic isn't something that we can just be used and abused without consequences. And honestly, this is the part of the world that made me the most curious. Because when a fantasy book introduces something that everyone refuses to discuss, you immediately want to know, okay, but what happened? What went wrong? Why is everyone afraid? What secret is everyone hiding? And that mystery is what keeps pulling you forward. One thing I really appreciated about this setup is that every London feels different. They aren't just different locations with different names. They have different personalities, different moods, different relationships with power. And that's something fantasy sometimes struggles with. Creating a world that feels big. Because a fantasy world can have 1,000 pages of history, but if it doesn't feel alive, readers won't care. And for me, the Four Londons concept is where this book immediately shines. Now that we understand the world of A Darker Shade of Magic, we need to talk about the person who makes traveling between these worlds possible. Kell. Kell Marish, the mysterious traveler, the person who can walk between the Londons. And honestly, Kell is exactly the kind of character that fantasy readers love. He has the perfect combination of mystery, power, and emotional baggage, which, if we're being honest, is basically the fantasy protagonist starter pack. Give me a character who has a complicated past, a dangerous ability, and absolutely refuses to talk about their feelings, and fantasy readers will immediately become invested. Kell is an Antari, and Antari are incredibly rare. There are people with the ability to travel between worlds, which means Kell isn't just someone who lives in one London. He belongs to multiple worlds. He has accesses to places most people will never see. And that creates a really interesting conflict for his character. Because imagine having the ability to go anywhere. Imagine being able to walk through a door and suddenly you're somewhere completely different. A different city, a different culture, a different version of reality. That sounds amazing. But at the same time, wouldn't that also make you feel like you don't completely belong anywhere? I think that's one of the most interesting parts about Kell. He's surrounded by incredible things. He has this rare ability. He sees things nobody else sees. But there's also this loneliness attached to it. Because when you're the only person who can do something, that thing that makes you special can also make you isolated. And I think that's where Kell becomes more interesting than just cool magic guy that can travel between worlds. Because underneath all that, he's someone trying to figure out where he actually fits. Another thing I like about Kell is that he isn't presented as this unbeatable fantasy hero, and that matters. Because sometimes fantasy characters become so powerful that the story starts losing tension. If someone can solve every problem with magic, then why should we worry? But Kell has limitations. He makes mistakes, he takes risks. He doesn't always know what the right decision is. And honestly, flawed characters are always more interesting. Perfect characters are impressive, but messy characters are memorable. Now we need to talk about the character who completely changes the energy of this story. Lila Bard, my favorite. And I have a feeling Lila is going to be one of those characters that divides readers because she is not the type of character who politely waits for adventure to happen. No, Lila sees adventure coming and immediately jumps in front of it. Lila is a thief from Grey London. She has grown up in a world where nothing exciting happens, a world where she feels trapped, and she has one major goal.
Now.
She wants more.
Now.
She doesn't want an ordinary life. She doesn't want to spend her entire existence doing what everyone expects her to do. She wants freedom. She wants adventure. She wants to see what's beyond the small world she knows. And honestly, I think a lot of readers connect with that feeling. That feeling of looking at your life and thinking, is this really all there is? The interesting thing about Lila is that she isn't a character who dreams about adventure from a safe distance. She actively creates chaos. She takes risks. She makes decisions that leave you thinking, Lila, maybe don't do that. The moments are There are moments where you are absolutely fascinated by her confidence. And then there are moments where you want to reach into the book and say, can we please just think about this plan for more than 3 seconds? But honestly, that is also what makes her entertaining. Because Lila has personality. She has ambition. She has a strong sense of who she wants to become. She isn't just there to support Kell's story. She has her own dreams, her own motivations, her own reasons for wanting to see the world. And I think that it is important because one of the easiest mistakes fantasy stories can make is creating a character whose only purpose is to help the main character. Lila doesn't feel like that. She feels like someone who would have a story even if Kell wasn't involved. One of my favorite parts of this book is seeing Kell and Lila interact because they are such opposite people. Kell is controlled. He understands responsibility. He knows the dangers of the world he travels through. Lila is basically, what if we just did something incredibly dangerous and figure it out later? And somehow that works. Their relationship is interesting because neither one of them is exactly what the other person needs, but they challenge each other. Kell needs someone who reminds him that he is more than just his responsibilities. Lila needs someone who reminds her that freedom doesn't mean ignoring consequences. They balance each other out. And I think that's part of why readers enjoy this story, because at its core, this isn't just a story about magic. It's about two people who are searching for something. Kell is searching for belonging. Lila is searching for possibility. And their paths crossing changes both of them. Now, let's talk about one of the biggest parts of any fantasy book, the magic. Because a fantasy story can have the coolest characters in the world, but if the magic doesn't work, the entire world can fall apart. And thankfully, I think a darker shade of magic does something really well. It makes magic feel powerful. I know, obvious, right? But it also makes magic feel dangerous. The magic in this world isn't just a random ability that characters use whenever they need a solution. There's a relationship between people and magic. There's a balance. There are consequences. And I think that is what makes magic systems interesting. The question isn't, can someone use magic? The question is, what happens when they do? Because power always changes people. And this book constantly plays with that idea. Magic can create beauty. It can create incredible things. It can connect worlds. But it can also destroy. It can corrupt. It can make people believe they deserve more power than anyone else. And honestly, that is one of the reasons the world works so well. Because the magic just doesn't exist in the background. It affects the entire society. It changes how people live, how people think, how people fight. I think that is where this book really starts becoming more than just a cool fantasy idea. Because underneath all the magic and adventure, there are questions about power, about control, about what people are willing to sacrifice to get what they want. So far, we've talked about the world, we've talked about Kell, we've talked about Lila, we've talked about the magic. But now we need to talk about the actual story. Because having a cool concept is one thing. A book can have the most interesting world imaginable, but if the story doesn't pull you in, none of that matters. And I think A Darker Shade of Magic is interesting because it starts almost like an adventure story. You have Kell moving between Londons, you have secrets, you have this feeling that something bigger is happening, and then slowly things begin to unravel. One of the things I enjoyed about this story is that it doesn't immediately throw every answer at you. It lets the mystery build. You know there's something wrong. You know there are things people aren't saying. You know that the history between these Londons is more complicated than anyone wants to admit. And that feeling of something happened here and everyone is pretending it didn't is one of my favorite things in fantasy. Because honestly, mystery is what makes fantasy worlds feel ancient. A world feels real when it feels like it existed before you arrived. When there are old stories, lost histories, things people have forgotten, secrets that characters are still uncovering. And this book does a good job creating that feeling. Now, we need to talk about the villain.
Now.
Because a fantasy story is only as interesting as the conflict standing in its way. And the
Now.
villain in A Darker Shade of Magic is interesting because they aren't just evil for the sake of being evil. The best villains usually have something underneath the surface. A reason, a belief, a twisted version of something understandable. The villain represents one of the biggest themes in this book, the desire for power. Because power is a dangerous thing, especially magical power. When someone has the ability to change the world, what happens when they decide the world should change according to their rules? What happens when someone stops seeing people as people and starts seeing them as obstacles? And I think that's what makes this conflict work. It's not just good person fights bad person. It's how far will someone go when they believe they deserve everything? The villain is a reminder that magic itself isn't the problem. The
Now.
problem is people. People who want control. People who want to prove they are important. People who believe having power means they have the right to use it however they want. Now let's talk about the things that really worked for me, because overall, I understand why people love this book. The biggest strength is absolutely the atmosphere. This book made me want to explore, made me want to open a mysterious door and see where it leads. And I think that's one of the greatest compliments you can give a fantasy book. Not just, it was a good story, but I wish I could visit this world. The Four Londons concept is genuinely fascinating. It is such a simple idea, but it creates so many possibilities because every reader immediately starts thinking, what would my version of London look like? What would my world be like if magic existed? What would change? I also really enjoyed the characters. Kell has that classic fantasy mystery that pulls you in. Lila brings chaos and personality, and together they create a really fun dynamic. They aren't perfect, they make mistakes, they frustrate you sometimes, but they feel like actual people. And honestly, that is what keeps me interested in continuing the series. Because when you finish a fantasy book, the biggest question is, do I want to spend more time with these characters? And with this one, the answer is absolutely yes. Now, even though I enjoyed this book, I do want to talk about the things that didn't completely work for me, because no book is perfect. And sometimes the things that make a book special for one person are the exact things that bother someone else. The biggest thing I noticed was the pacing. The beginning is very, very focused on introducing the world. And honestly, I appreciate that because the world is complicated. There are multiple Londons, there are different rules, there's history to explain, but it does mean the story takes a little bit of time before it really gets moving. The first part of the book feels like, let me introduce you to this incredible world, and the second half feels like, okay, now everything is happening all at once. For me, the second half was definitely stronger. Once the characters, the conflict, and the stakes became clearer, that was when I really started getting invested. Another thing is that I think this book depends heavily on whether you connect with the characters, because if Kell and Lila doesn't work for you, the story might feel slower. But if you enjoy them, the journey becomes so much more rewarding. So, was A Darker Shade of Magic worth the hype? My answer is yes, but maybe not in the way I expected. I went into this book expecting a huge, complicated fantasy epic. And while it definitely has those elements, the thing I loved most was the feeling. The feeling that there was always another world waiting, another door, another possibility. Do I think it was perfect? No. There were moments where the pacing slowed down. There were moments where I wanted more answers. But overall, I understand why this book has become such a beloved fantasy recommendation, because it captures something really important about reading. The reason we love books isn't just because of the stories, it's because sometimes a story gives us somewhere else to go. My final rating? 4 out of 5 stars. Would I continue the series? Absolutely! Because after spending this much time exploring these Londons, I want to know what happens next. I want more Kell. I want more Lila. And honestly, I want to see what the other doors are waiting to be opened. If you enjoyed this video, let me know what book I should read next. I am officially making my way through the books that everyone says are must-reads. and we are finding out together if they actually deserve the hype. If you like cozy gaming, books, and watching someone slowly build an impossible TBR pile, consider subscribing. And I'll see you in the next one.